we're back. Here we find ourselves in the last part of Dear Esther. So let's talk about the story for realsies, and let's talk about some of the religious implications for real, and what the actual religious symbolism probably is in this game. I think it's probably the case that that it is an open question as to whether you're walking around as the narrator or as somebody else, as some third party that is just sort of experiencing this. And for the sake of discussion, I guess I'm going to err on thinking that the player is an independent character. It's not the narrator, not anybody else who came before the narrator, and isn't Esther either.
I sat here and watched two jets carve parallel white lines into the sky. They charted their course, and I followed them for 21 minutes.
Again, we're going to be doing spoilers pretty quickly here, and I'm about to hit you with one. Whether it occurs to you or not, at this point, playing for the first time, the character is definitely thinking a lot about death, about failure, and even about suicide. And all of that, points towards the conclusion of the game, but it's pointing towards that being a positive decision. And you can criticize the makers of the game for thinking in those terms, but I think that they're aiming for themes that sort of make sense if you think about them in the way that the narrator is thinking about them. But there is a real problem in this insofar as finding what is actually intelligible about the story, and it's a problem for the player, and I think it's there because of the choices of themes and how this story was chosen that it should be told. And the conclusion is obviously there at this point. I think that this is an open-ended sort of experience. Again, something did happen. You as the viewer have to assume that there is some intelligible story going on, and it's just hard to find here. And that's something you have to reckon with at a certain point. Now, of course, the story is intended to be open-ended. It's intended to be something that we can think about, and that's the point of the story. But at the same time, everybody's going to come with their own expectations to any game. Now, what that means is, for me, particularly, who's a person who wants there to be something intelligible there. I mean, I want the story to be about something, and I feel like, I feel like I'm giving the developer the benefit of the doubt to say that there is something intelligible here, even though it's hard to find. But I think it is a problem, and so, somebody from my perspective is going to, want to be critical of what this presentation really means. And I know that this, began as a mod in the source engine and so forth, but those expectations are still there. I mean, this is clearly an attempt to tell something moving. It's obviously there to move you, and so I think it's perfectly fair to have these expectations that there is something intelligible here, that there's a point to all this, and that it's not just me as the viewer doing all the work here. So, somebody from my perspective is probably going to look at the story here and be critical of it, and be critical of how this presentation actually works and so forth, because it's a problem. So if you're thinking about this game critically, that is one side that you're sort of forced to think about when you look at this great experiment of open presentation. But the flip side of that is the fact that it's obvious that the developers are putting expectations on you, and maybe that is fair of them. I mean, maybe that's the best thing to do, to put all these expectations on you, and thereby give you the paintbrush and give you the benefit of the doubt, to allow you to make these decisions for yourself. As the player, you have the paintbrush. But if this story is intelligible, I think you have to decide at the end that what this story is about is it's about suicide. It's about suffering tragedy and then committing suicide. And I think that's the plainest way of describing what these themes are. But that's sort of the conclusion. This whole game is an exercise in, walking up to that precipice and then jumping. And, you can talk about, leap of faith, that sort of stuff too. And maybe that's there, I don't know. But the conclusion, I think, is, it is suicide. That is the conclusion of the story.
He said he'd been traveling back from a sales
Now, the flip side of all these sort of suicide affirming and in my skeptical thought, affirming of sort of religious practices is when you step back at this. I mean, the reason you can't really get mad at this, in my opinion, is because when you step back and look at it, what you're seeing is a person who was destroyed by grief because of this thing that happened in his life, and then he basically isolated himself on this island and went crazy and painted all these religious things on these mountains and so forth, and was just scrambling to find meaning, and he ended up killing himself. And so I think part of what this game is inhabiting that, sure, and maybe you can call that affirming it or validating it in a certain sense, but
I collected all the letters
but I don't think that's necessarily so. But because when you step back at it, what you see is something that is natural, but it's also tragic, and anybody can say it's tragic. You don't have to say that this is a good thing or a bad thing or whatever. It's just this tragic event.
I set the fleet to sail, shattered into 21 pieces.
So in talking about the themes of this game in this way, I'm sort of anticipating the potential, sort of reactionary criticism that maybe the developers are sort of advocating suicide. And I think that that's a bit like blaming the sentiment of the person who is suicidal, and I don't think that that's okay either intellectually or personally, because these are real tragedies, and they people do these things for real reasons, and this is just a piece of art inhabiting that feeling. So it's not necessarily affirming suicide, I don't think, and I don't think it's saying it's bad either. It's just inhabiting this feeling of wanting to do it and succeeding in doing it in the end. But leaving that sort of literalist interpretation of all these events behind and going back to the themes, I think what the core nature of the theme is that we are on a journey, and so to think about what that is in a religious sense, I think that there's something here about turning back and whether you should turn back and so forth. And of course, the narrator, or rather you in this case, the player, ends up being forced deciding, who knows, but ends up concluding this journey across this island, and journey through all this grief that the character has suffered. You end up doing it by committing suicide.
When Paul keeled over dead on the road to Damascus, they resuscitated him by hitting him in the chest with stones gathered by the roadside. He was lifeless for 21 minutes, certainly long enough for the oxygen levels in his brain to have decreased and caused hallucinations and delusions of transcendence. I'm running out of painkillers.
But contrary to all of that, there are these themes of turning back and so forth. So I think there's something conflicting here, and I think we're about to peek over and see this ghost across the way, one of the many ghosts in this game. But you can still ask, why are these come back? Why is this turn back? Why is this sort of repentance theme coming up? And I think, it's partly just sort of playing the other side of the argument as far as committing suicide. But I think also I think there's definitely a sense, and the reason that it's religious is that I think there's a sense of committing suicide is turning back. It is repenting. It's changing your life and undoing the mistakes that you've made. And in a literal sense, I absolutely disagree. I think that that's crazy in the literal sense. But people do make these decisions. I think it's a viable human experience and so forth to look at all this grief and end up thinking that committing suicide is turning back. It is repenting, and it is reforming yourself in a sort of certain sense. And I think that is the key sort of religious take on this game. And I think it is probably an intended theme. I think it's probably intended. Now, whether you can say that that's the game developers sort of advocating that, or whether it's just, the character of the narrator advocating it, and we're the developers just watching that human experience happening. I don't know, which is which, really. But it's sort of irrelevant, really, because it's certainly right to look at whether people think about it, because they do think about it, and people make this conclusion. And so if we're talking about my personal interpretation of it, like my sort of valuation of the message that we're getting here, my evaluation is we're looking at, something that's tragic, but it is the wrong decision. I think it definitely is the wrong decision, and not just because I had reservations about religion, but just judging from my own life, I can definitely see a similar trick where you assume that there's a plan, and in so assuming, you come to think that your failures are part of this plan, and that you are cooperating with the plan by giving up and by succumbing to these troubles. And I think that is part of religion, as far as you as a person realizing at a certain point in your life that you're bad or that you have failures and so forth. And I think that religion is something that pulls you to say, oh, it's okay, all these things that are bad that have happened, that's part of something real and magical, and so forth. And at this point in my life, I outrightly reject that. And I'm here talking about specifically how bad things can somehow be salvific, like that good can be, that bad's there so that good can be drawn from it. That's what I reject specifically. But it seems to me that this is a mistake, and this is something that religion does, move you to think about. And without being too preachy, I think that what happens to the narrator here happens to people. And maybe it's not bad, but, looking at it from the outside, I couldn't help but hope that somebody like the narrator would conclude differently, I guess is the way to say it. That they would find a different solution. So maybe the game developers are trying to make me find exactly that conclusion. I think probably not. I think they just show it and let you make your own decision. But, I think that is the ultimate, the farthest, if you want to drag this narrative to the farthest reach it could possibly be driven, forgetting what the developers might have intended with the farthest conclusion. I think that's what this is not whether religion is true, but whether, it's an authentic human answer to this very human problem of suffering, and whether religion is an appropriate response, whether it's an appropriate, medium for that type of question. Because all religions are going to talk about death to some degree, some more than others, really. Some of them not so much, but as far as these Western monotheisms go, it's pretty fixated on right life, and consequently makes the supposition that there's such a thing as right death. I think when some people look at this game, they might want to think. If you're really criticizing the game, I think it's inevitable to ask whether something like religion has a place in a video game. And I think it does. And because of the tragedy of this story, I think that makes the best case for why religion has a place in this story, because it's a very common apology of religion in general, not a specific religion, but just religion. That is what religion is about. It's about coming to grips with mortality and so forth. And because that's definitely what this story is about, I think that makes it a perfect example of when it would be acceptable to bring religion and the actual, like, real discussion of what religion is and what place it has in our lives. And I just think this is an exemplary case of how it can be talked about in art, in a story, and, by extension, in a video game. And here we have our final and most obvious ghost, or I think most obvious. But I mean, that's a question that I feel like this game brings up, and whether it be because just this game isn't incredibly, it's not a hugely popular game.
I've run out of places to climb,
or whatever. I think that
this body and take
it brings up the question, and I think it does so successfully. And it doesn't, it's not browbeating. It's not giving you clear answers. It's letting you make your own decisions about it.
Mine will be written all across this island. Who was Jakobsen? Who remembers him? Donnelly has written of him.
In the event that you have gotten this far and you haven't actually played this game, what's happening now is not actually in the player's control. This is a on-rails segment that you cannot prevent, as far as I know. This is the intended end of the game.
Become an aerial, a beacon, that they will not forget you. We've always been drawn here. One day the gulls will return and nest in our bones and our history.
And if we're looking at this dialogue, this is like a defeatist point of view that is somehow positive. We're playing this nice music and so forth over it, and the narrator certainly believes that this is the right decision, that he's justified to do this, and so forth. Again, who knows whether that's right. I don't think the developer says what's right or wrong, and I think that's probably a good way to look at it, really, especially in a medium like this, which is aimed to be art. It's aimed to be artistic, and thereby has no obvious and certain answer. So while we've probably found a bit of a conclusion to this, lots of questions remain. Are people doomed to make these same mistakes here? Are the ghosts of Esther here, the narrator, Jakobsen, or are those ghosts somewhere else? And is that place good? Is coming there good? The game doesn't provide those kinds of answers. It's mostly just providing the question and letting you think about it. And it definitely is in like company among other forms of art and other media. So yeah, that's Dear Esther. I sort of sat on this last part for a while because I had trouble concluding what the story was and what all the themes really meant. And again, it's an open question, I think, and so forth. But I've certainly been able to decide what I think it's about for me. So yeah. So I'm going to continue to do some of these. I'm going to try to be sort of semi-regular, and thinking about some other formats, what I like best, how I would like best to do a game where, it's actually requires some skill to play. So I'm tinkering with that stuff, and I hope you enjoyed it, and please like, subscribe, comment, follow me on Twitter, and continue the conversation about story in games.